morning, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, The Long Reckoning, Redemption in Vietnam, 50 Years Later. We are joined by George Black, who is a writer, journalist, and author of The Long Reckoning, A Story of War, Peace, and Redemption in Vietnam, which is the subject of our discussion today. Our moderator is Ambassador Ted Osius, President and CEO of the U.S. Association of Southeast Asian Nations Business Council and former U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam. For those of you who would like to submit questions for our speakers, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. I'll be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. Thank you both so much for being here, and Ambassador Osius, I'll hand the conversation over to you.
Rachel, thank you very much. Thanks for asking me to moderate this discussion with my friend George. George, you have written, I think, a spectacular book. You really know how to tell the stories of the people who engaged in this very long reckoning with Vietnam. I believe no one ever has told the story of war legacies as you have. You tell what happened about Agent Orange, about unexploded ordnance, about dealing with prisoners of war and those thought to be missing in action. For this audience in particular that's interested in how what happened leads to the present day, let's just note that only in September, President Biden went to Vietnam and elevated the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. How do you think these legacy issues, such as Agent Orange, unexploded ordnance, and dealing with POW MIAs, how do you think that dealing with those issues laid the groundwork for this new relationship?
Yeah, thank you, Ted, and always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you, Rachel and the World Affairs Council for hosting this today. I want to start with the title of the book, really. I mean, I think both the words in the title, apart from the, are very crucial. One is reckoning and one is long. We're now almost 50 years on. And the Biden visit that you refer to, Ted, is the culmination of a process that has been underway in fits and starts, an often very difficult process for all these decades. I don't think still even now we're quite there. There is still unfinished business between the two countries. But the idea for the book came from actually a quote by, or the idea for the title, I should say, came from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1808. He was talking about wars in Europe and the danger of getting entangled in wars. And he said, the evils of war are great in their endurance, and they have a long reckoning for ages to come. And it's true of every war. It's going to be true of Israel and Gaza. It's going to be true of Ukraine. It was true of World War II. I grew up in the post-World War II years and was very aware of it still as a kid growing up in the 50s and 60s. So that's really the framework. And what's interesting about the comprehensive partnership announced by Biden in Hanoi in September is that it's an extraordinary thing because it puts relations between the US and Vietnam on the same footing as Vietnam's relations with China and Russia, its two principal world wartime allies. So this is a very big deal. And, you know, diplomacy is full of these words that have very subtle and precise meaning. And to get it elevated to those three words is a very critical development. Especially, I think, when you think about the hard place that process began. This was an unusual war, and in some ways for Americans, at least until Afghanistan, and even that I would say is of a different order, it was a unique war because the American story, the American self-belief system, if you want to say it that way, until Vietnam, was that the distinct role of the world, the identity in the world of the United States was this blend of moral virtue, righteousness, and unparalleled power. And America went into the war driven by those two assumptions, that it was fighting a moral fight, despite all the revelations in later years of how the government misrepresented its intentions or told many lies in the process, which we discovered from the Pentagon Papers. But it was, essentially portrayed, sincerely or otherwise, as a moral mission. And it would be accomplished by overwhelming force of arms, which the United States uniquely possessed. And it all went wrong. Now, this isn't the place to debate how and why it went wrong, but the aftermath of it going wrong was that this American story of virtue and strength was really shattered in a unique way. America had never lost a war. Some people dealt with that by denying that the war had been lost and portraying a narrative where the soldiers and the military men had been betrayed by faithless civilians and dishonest journalists. The veterans came home, no one knew what to do with them. The veterans themselves, their families, their girlfriends, their loved ones didn't know how to deal with the fact of defeat. It got suppressed. The political narrative around it was very confused. And there was a huge amount of vindictiveness toward Vietnam. The resentment of this unprecedented defeat. And what was interesting, and I think forms the backdrop to the book, is that I think uniquely among wars, one of the truisms of a war is that the winners get to write the terms of the post-war. And in Vietnam, the opposite was true. The terms under which Vietnam came away from the wartime experience and dealt with the realities of being an independent country were largely dictated by the United States. Because even though it didn't have the military power to prevail on the battlefield, it did still have the unparalleled economic and political power to dictate how the post-war years would pan out. And when you combine that with a very tough and hardline government in Hanoi, very fiercely, not only independent-minded, but also having used, Marxist-Leninist ideology of a very intense and often very dogmatic form. You put those two things together, in Vietnam went through 10 to 15 years of absolute misery and penury. And so that was the backdrop, I think, that finally toward the late 1980s and the second Reagan administration began to show that both countries, when they stood back from the hostility and thought about it, both had something to gain from identifying common interests. And I think that those embryos of common interest and knowing how to focus on those and leave other things aside, that's the key to how the process of reconciliation very painfully began. And of course, you had a very early experience of that, because uniquely among the diplomatic community, you were there in the early days of the reconciliation, even before full diplomatic relations were restored. And you know from that experience how tough the backdrop to that process was.
Well, it was painful and slow. And I think you're right that it got started creaking along. There were some attempts made during the Carter administration for the two sides to connect, and those were not successful, and they were shot down for a number of reasons. And then America wanted to forget about Vietnam for a while, and so during most of the two Reagan terms, the United States kind of turned its back on Vietnam. And there were fewer attempts made during that time, but there was some outreach by Vietnamese leaders because of the difficulties they were facing that you described. The famine in the 1980s was terrible. And this was a time that they were also fighting a war in Cambodia. They were fighting a war against China on the north, and the suffering that had been going on through the French period and through the war with the United States really continued. But you mentioned common interests, where we could find common interests. And I think you're right. The evils of war are great in their endurance. And so the process of unraveling all of that anger and that bitterness was going to be complicated, but there were some common interests, and you describe some of those common interests in the book. And I wonder if those common interests carry us along far enough to be able to deal with the challenges that we still face in the relationship, because it's still a one-party system run by the Communist Party. We still have differences over human rights. We still have differences over freedom of expression. Vietnam does not follow America's instructions when it comes to dealing with Russia, for example. It's not an ally. It's not likely to become an ally. But what are the common interests that we've built on that have enabled us to move from the enduring evils to a partnership and a friendship today?
Yeah, when I say that the the United States, probably uniquely among post-war situations, had the power to dictate the sequence, excuse me, the sequence by which the wartime legacies were unraveled, I think you can identify a pretty clear sequence, which, if you want, begins with something that isn't really technically a post-war legacy, so much as a sort of pragmatic self-interest where, as you say, after this catastrophic first 10 years of famine, economic failure, 5-year Soviet-style economic plans that didn't work, Vietnam wanted to open up to the world, to stabilize its economy, to achieve some level of self-sufficiency. And other countries were getting involved, coming in to invest. And the American business community wanted a part of that because they were going to lose what was potentially a very significant and interesting market. So that, in a sense, is the most, if you want to put it this way, the most kind of cold-bloodedly trade-oriented, economically oriented self-interest. But then that came at exactly the same time, that opening that came in Vietnam in 1986, when the hardline leader of Vietnam, who had taken over from Ho Chi Minh, Le Duan, passed away. There was a new generation of leadership in Hanoi, and the central impasse between the two countries at that point was that the United States was unwilling to talk about anything else in the post-war situation other than the fate of Americans who were missing in action. And there were about 2,600 of those, which in relation to Korea and certainly to World War II was a relatively modest number. Nonetheless, for purely humanitarian reasons, I think everyone would agree, when a country sends its young men to war, it has a moral obligation to bring them back. So the United States felt that obligation very powerfully. The Vietnamese were extremely hostile and suspicious at first, but I think they saw that cooperating on that to search for the remains of those men, most of whom were pilots who came down in remote areas. It was not easy to find them, but the Vietnamese realized that they had an interest in being helpful. And the United States, frankly, realized in the second Reagan administration that the hard line on POWs, who didn't even exist, frankly, and MIAs, wasn't getting them anywhere. It wasn't bringing the remains back. So that was the first sense in which, on a wartime issue, there was a sense of common ground. And once that common ground was established and the two governments began to do joint searches with the cooperation of the Vietnamese military, then you had the first glimmering of trust. And that was such that you could then move on to the second issue, which was, okay, the United States would reciprocate for that help by providing a modest amount of assistance, initially through non-governmental sources, notably including veterans organizations. Bobby Mueller, who was one of the best known of the American veterans, along with Senator John Kerry, initiated a program to provide humanitarian aid to the disabled in the form of prosthetic devices. Bobby himself having been confined to a wheelchair from the injuries he sustained in Vietnam. So that modest program, initially very, very controversial in America, that began in the late 80s. And once you had the momentum coming from that, plus these first economic overtures, the beginning of an opening of Vietnam to foreign visitors and tourists, foreign non-governmental organizations, you could then sort of make the fairly logical and in a way sort of uncontroversial step of moving from supplying the disabled population of Vietnam with wheelchairs and prosthetics and orthotics to saying, well, why are so many Vietnamese walking around disabled, blinded, or missing limbs, or paralyzed in wheelchairs? And so many of them were the result of the huge amount of unexploded ordnance that was still lying around in the fields of Vietnam. Kids were picking up cluster bombs and getting blown up. Farmers were hoeing their fields and setting off hand grenades buried in the mud, which was the product of this immense amount of military technology that the United States used to win the war. And so the first programs began and the first government involvement began with the State Department being willing to come in and support the effort to provide humanitarian aid and then the removal of these unexploded weapons from the battlefields, which began end of the 80s, moved into the 90s. The amounts of money that were appropriated in the process, and I would single out very, very much one of my personal heroes, a man I know you have a huge amount of respect for, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who created the Leahy War Victims Fund, which was designed to bring this kind of humanitarian assistance, started with Vietnam, expanded over time to some 50 countries, to deal with this long humanitarian reckoning that follows wars. So that takes you, I think, to the point where you came into the scene as, a young political military officer in Hanoi before there was even a full embassy representation. And I think you came in at that very critical time and you saw how it was then in the mid-90s.
Well, that's right. And I think your sequencing is precisely right. Even when normalization of diplomatic relations was declared, when President Clinton declared it in 1995, that debate over what was the best way to deal with the MIA challenge was still raging in the United States. You could see like warring op-eds on that date. If we normalize relations, we'll have a better chance of accounting for those whom we lost. But on the other side, it was no, they haven't done enough to account for those whom we've lost, so we shouldn't normalize relations. We should hold on to that until they've done more. It was a very emotional debate, and I think if you look back at that period of time, that was the time of the Rambo films. It was the time that Time magazine had a picture of a guy with his eyes covered, was allegedly being held in a tiger cage. Very emotional issue that divided us along partisan lines and along the lines of how people had suffered during the war, whether they'd been opposed to the war or were part of the war effort. But you mentioned something very important. You said we found common ground on this issue of POW MIA. The Vietnamese wanted what they wanted, which was they wanted to be ushered into the global economy. We knew what we wanted, and we found some common ground there. and we were able to build trust. And it seems to me this is the crux of what has led us to today. We found common ground. Then we were able to find some common ground on cleaning up unexploded ordnance and its importance. And people took great risks to engage in that effort. I think of people like Chun Van Ka and of course Chuck Searcy, whom you write about, so many others who took great risks. And that finally led us, and certainly Senator Leahy, that finally led us to a place where we could start a really difficult discussion about dioxin and Agent Orange, which was the political third rail in the United States and really important to the Vietnamese. Yeah. They wanted something to be done about the toxins in their soils. So maybe that leads us to a discussion about how some of the individuals who were engaged in this effort helped build on those common interests and build trust. And you write about Charles Bailey and his efforts to bring about a rational discussion of what was happening with regard to Agent Orange. Because if the discussion is, oh, Agent Orange is soaking the soil everywhere, everybody who's disabled is disabled as a result of Agent Orange, well, then you can't do anything about it. Similarly, if the discussion is there's unexploded ordnance everywhere, everyone's going to die as a result of it, well, then you can't do anything about it. But when you start to contain the problem, then you can start to address it, and they started looking seriously at the extent of the unexploded ordnance problem, seriously at the extent of poison by dioxin, especially in certain key hotspots. And then when we started doing things together, that built more trust. So can you tell us about how that process worked and who made it happen?
Yeah, and also, I mean, to start with your question about the overwhelming nature of this, it's everywhere. So how do you get a handle on it? How do you start? Where do you start? I made a decision early on, largely as a result of spending quite a bit of time in a particular area of the country. You mentioned Chuck Searcy. What curiosity, as some veterans began to do in the early 1990s. And then finally went back at the end of 1994 to work for Bobby Mueller on a prosthetics program. A lot of Chuck's life since then has been devoted to the question of unexploded ordnance and to some degree Agent Orange in a particular area of the country called Quang Tri province, which is immediately south of the old demilitarized zone. And that began to raise the question of why the destruction of the war was so heavily concentrated in this very, very small area of Quang Tri, the immediately contiguous province where Hamburger Hill was, the one battle that every American, I think, has heard of. And then the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Laos on the other side of the border. Everything in the story seemed to come together in that place. And the Agent Orange discussion, which really I think is in many ways the heart of the book, for many reasons. It's the most emotional part of the war legacies. It's the one where the ongoing humanitarian effects are the greatest. And it was the most contentious and controversial. One thing, I could have written a very angry book, and I think a lot of people have written very angry books about Vietnam. And in a way, I did that the anger over things like double standards. For example, Americans lost 2,600 missing in action. Vietnam, no one even knows how many. The guess is usually around 300,000. But if you talk to Vietnamese, they don't say that's appalling double standards. They say it's wonderful that the United States is finally now helping us to find our MIAs. And if you talk about Agent Orange, you very similar response. It's wonderful that the United States is now doing things to help our children and our grandchildren, and those who have suffered because of this. And, the double standards, in a sense, to an American, I think, are so egregious, particularly because during the years when Agent Orange was so politically, as you say, a third rail between America and Vietnam and a hot potato domestically, it was impossible to have a rational conversation. And it's very important to say that even when the Reagan administration was in office, there was a great deal of rhetoric, especially in his first term, about how it was a noble cause. And, the troops had been betrayed by politicians. Nonetheless, in the second Reagan term especially, Reagan did the American veteran community no favors. He slashed the budget for the Veterans Administration. The scientific studies that were conducted about the claims of American veterans to be suffering from diseases that might be related to their exposure to Agent Orange during the war were found by an intensive congressional investigation to have been a cover-up, to have started with predetermined conclusions and twisted and limited the science to prove those conclusions. And the American veterans, let's never forget, had to wait for 16 years after the war, 20 years after Agent Orange was last sprayed, to get a recognition, not based on incontrovertible scientific evidence, but based on a combination of politics and guilt and moral responsibility, that yes, they had to be recognized. And so we got the Agent Orange Act. But even after the Agent Orange Act, which was 1991, and it entitled veterans for the first time to be eligible for benefits, medical treatment and benefits, their exposure to Agent Orange during the war. But the Vietnamese scientists who had been working on this since 1969 were written off as propagandists, as communists, liars, as extortionists who just wanted war reparations. And that actually, more than any other thing, did make me angry, because these were scientists of world-renowned stature. The leading scientist behind those early Vietnamese efforts was writing scholarly journal articles in The Lancet, the most famous British medical journal. He was a liver disease specialist. And one of the first manifestations in Vietnam was this incredible prevalence of liver disease in returning veterans from the battlefield, men in their 20s, coming down with liver cancer. So it took many, many years first for the veterans here to get their due. And then finally, in the early years after 2000, for scientific studies that were carried out by teams of Vietnamese and Canadian, above all, scientists, and some Americans, to show that it was actually an isolated problem. It was a problem that could be managed, because once you did intensive field studies of where the dioxin was, you essentially found that it was confined after these many years of, evaporation through natural processes, absorption into the natural environment, disappearance. It was concentrated around former American air bases. So you had a sort of two-pronged process at that point, where, interestingly, and you know this story very well from your own experience, there was a bifurcation. On one hand, we've got to clean up the bases, and the US government will take responsibility for that because the problem has been proven, the samples have been taken, it's in the ground, it's in the groundwater, it's affecting the surrounding populations of some of the former air bases. But then on the other hand, there was the more contentious problem, which is, what do you do about the individuals who have the same kind of disabilities and birth defects that Vietnam veterans in this country and their offspring were encountering? And that meant the assumption by the US government of a different level of liability and accountability. if you had to say this person is sick because of what we did. That proved to be a much rockier path, and still, to some extent, continues to be so.
There's lots of room for anger and lots of room for bitterness, but I'm with you. That's not the experience I've ever had in Vietnam, and I've been going there now for 30 years. It's amazing that in every province you find people who suffered from the war, but who are so ready to be friends with the United States. And we poll sort of 92, 94% positive, the United States does, in the country of Vietnam. That people look at the United States as their country's best friend. It's by enormous margins. I don't think that's an accident. I think it's that people took risks to bring us together. They worked hard. They did things together. Well, as Pete Peterson, the first U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, said, it wasn't a miracle that it happened. It was a result of people of goodwill and commitment and courage who brought our two countries together. And you have written beautifully about many of those people, some of them whose names are not well known, but who made all the difference in the world. What was it that was so effective about their engagement?
I think a number of things. I do focus on it's almost a collective biography, I suppose, of about 6, 7 people who came out of different backgrounds. And I've always used this image of the Venn diagram, that they belong to overlapping circles, and the point of their intersection almost invariably led to Agent Orange. It led to many things, but above all to Agent Orange. And I would categorize them in 3 groups. One was returning veterans like Chuck Searcy, and a returning Marine who had a very, very hard war, struggled hard with PTSD after the war, finally went back, lives there, is married to a Vietnamese woman. The second group, which I mentioned, is and the third group is a group of remarkable, mainly women, who came out of the wartime humanitarian tradition, often with a very strong influence of the Quakers. One of them, Lady Borton, worked for the American Friends Service. Lady Borton, exactly, who worked for the American Friends Service Committee in Quang Ngai province in the 2-year period, 69 to 71. Another is a remarkable woman called Susan Hammond, who is the daughter of a Vietnam veteran who actually passed away as a result of an Agent Orange-related disease, and now runs a small group, a very effective group called the War Legacies Project. And, you know, together, there's that famous Margaret Mead quote that I always quote to people, you know, never doubt that a small group of committed individuals can change the world. She says, indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I think what those people accomplished was 2 things. One, they started, all of them, by not arriving in Vietnam with prescriptions. You know, Vietnam was sick of foreigners prescribing things, especially Americans. They'd seen enough of that. They didn't lead with their checkbook because Vietnamese were tired of people thinking that throwing money at them was the solution to their problems. These people all arrived in Vietnam and basically said 2 things. What do you need and how can we help? The second thing that they accomplished was to have a very astute sense, backed up by a lot of hard work and imagination and innovation, about where recalcitrant government authorities in the United States could be pushed, and where you could find the chinks that you could push at, you know, open the wedge, persuade government officials that taking accountability, responsibility for what had happened was not only feasible, it was politically unavoidable and it was politically necessary. If you were going to build a relationship between the two countries that maximized those common interests we talked about, be they business interests, be they common interests in climate change, whatever, and many things that are not directly related to the war, like the common interest in fighting climate change, have grown organically really out of the relationship that grew over war legacy issues. It was very striking. We talked about Senator Leahy, who retired in January from the Senate, the last surviving member of the generation of senators who came to office during the war in Vietnam. And the last delegation that Senator Leahy planned, which unfortunately, because of ill health, he had to suspend, but another group of senators immediately followed. That went from looking at Agent Orange to going to the Mekong Delta to examine the effects of climate change and to identify areas of common interest to fight climate change. So there's an organic process there that now has gone beyond the immediate set of issues in the war. And I give an enormous amount of credit to those non-governmental individuals who pushed and pressed and cajoled and saw where the angles were, and then had the fortune of identifying what was initially a minority and over time became a larger and larger group of American officials, starting early on with people like you, who were receptive to these ideas, starting with Ambassador Peterson, who saw the importance, and gradually, translated the sway, the moral sway, and the persuasiveness of their arguments to policymakers, introduced it into the policy sphere, got Senator Leahy and others in the Senate of both parties, because these are humanitarian issues. These should not be, and often have not in the end been, humanitarian issues, but to get government to act where it had been unwilling to act. To the point where, during your tenure as ambassador in Hanoi, and then the succeeding ambassadors who've followed, Ambassador Napa now, Ambassador Crittenbrink before him, and then you, even bringing on board, through alliances with leading Republican politicians like John McCain, the Pentagon. So the entire panoply of the United States government is now involved in these issues of reconciliation and sees their interest in being involved.
What you're describing, a lot of the people, particularly those who are not in government, are people of goodwill and courage and commitment, who were just determined to bring us, the United States, closer to Vietnam. Now, political normalization has occurred, and I know I've got to switch in a couple of minutes to Rachel, who's going to give questions to the audience, but I want to ask one more question first. Political normalization has occurred between our two countries, and actually on the political level and in terms of government to government, things are going actually quite well. But it's been harder, and this is what I want to ask you about, it's been harder for people in the North and South to reconcile, and even asking this question is sensitive in Vietnam about reconciliation between Northerners and Southerners. But it was a civil war as well as a war of ideology, and in the view of the Vietnamese, a war for independence. And it's also been hard to reconcile with Người Mỹ gốc Việt, Vietnamese Americans, the diaspora that landed here starting in 1975 and for many years afterwards, and now constitutes 2.2 million Americans of Vietnamese origin. Why are those processes of reconciliation so hard?
Oh boy, the why is a very hard question to answer. The how is easier. I mean, Vietnamese will often say, one of the great ironies is that it's been so much easier to reconcile with the country that bombed us, as some put it, back into the Stone Age and killed 3 million people between the Americans and the French. It's been much easier to achieve that reconciliation than to reconcile with our own people. The distinctions and the traditional hostilities between North and South are very, very persistent. They are different cultures. The South has always been much more mercantile, with a very, very strong Chinese presence, entrepreneurial. The North has always been resented in the South for being high-handed, for assuming a sort of superiority. It came home to me very, very painfully, I think, last year when I was there for the last time, in visiting the homes of families who had lost kids during the war. And you look at the altars, the family altars, and the portraits of their sons, and their kids, whether they were Northern kids or Southern kids or American kids, they all look the same. They all look like photographs out of high school yearbooks. And as I said before, it is so preeminently a humanitarian issue that has been terribly politicized. I think there is hope from particularly the returning members of the younger generation of Vietnamese Americans that you talk about. There is some lessening of the rhetoric around the Southern war dead who have never been given their due. They've never been given acknowledgement as victims. And most of them were just kids who didn't know what they were fighting for. They were conscripts. The returning Vietnamese of the younger generation, they do have a different view. They are very pro-American. They are very entrepreneurial. They go back, they start businesses. But I think even the most enlightened Vietnamese politicians will tell you that it's going to be a very, very long and slow process. And that really until there has been a complete changing of the guard, a generational change within the Vietnamese party leadership, it's a long road. And it's very sad to see, to be honest.
It was a long road after our Civil War. Reconciliation is a long process. And I think that also helps to answer why it's been tough to reconcile with those the Vietnamese Americans in this country. When people suffer so terribly, sometimes it's hard to talk about forgiveness and reconciliation. Rachel is reminding me that there are a bunch of questions in the chat, and I don't want to monopolize. So Rachel, do you want to let us hit us with a few questions?
Rachel, before you do, I'm going to excuse myself. I need to bring my computer charger over and plug in. I've just noticed a horrifyingly low level of charge.
Okay.
Right. We don't want you to drop out on us.
No.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
And I see some questions are, a lot of the questions are for George and some of the questions are for me. So whatever you want.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we can start with one for you, Ambassador Osius, and thank you both again for being here. So this audience member first asked for Ambassador Osius.
You can hear me even if my back is turned while I plug this in. Sorry, bear with me.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, George. The Sons and Daughters in Touch led the largest ever Gold Star pilgrimage to Vietnam. 50 Gold Star sons and daughters visited the exact sites where their fathers were killed in 2003. Can you suggest how the lessons learned on the backs of Vietnam War Gold Star families can be a lesson for America's inevitable wartime future?
America's inevitable, did you say wartime future?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and George, I'll start on this one and then hand it to you and see if you have a different view. But my view is that some of the lessons that were learned on the backs of those who suffered the most are still very relevant. When the United States tries to change the form of a government, we should do so with humility. We learned that lesson, I think, very painfully in Afghanistan as well, that when we think that we can go in and be the sort of the transformational force that brings about a different kind of governance in a country, we ought to be very careful, because what happened in Vietnam is that Ho Chi Minh and the North wrapped themselves in the flag of nationalism and portrayed us as the invaders, trying to impose a foreign way on the people of Vietnam. And I think the same thing happened to us in Afghanistan. And one wonders, didn't we learn that lesson? in Vietnam, that we can't really change governments to look the way that we want them to look. And the other big lesson that I take from it is it's really important to understand history. This is why George's book is so important. It's really important to pay attention to what those whom we are thinking of entering into a conflict with, what they are focused on. And again, I think with the Taliban in Afghanistan, perhaps we were not we were not clear enough about what the motivations were of the Taliban and the people of Afghanistan, just as we weren't clear enough about what the motivations were of the people and governments of Vietnam. And if we had really studied our history before the Vietnam War, we would have known that the domino theory was bunk. It made no sense. The Vietnamese had fought 21 wars, now 22, against China, and we're not going to just follow the Chinese. And so I think we need to know our opponent, and we need to be humble in what we're trying to accomplish in places that are far away.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that very much. And I think part of what's so hard to swallow, just on the question of Afghanistan, is, you know, there was a great deal of idealism in particularly one issue, which was liberating girls and young women from the strictures of the Taliban and giving them an education. And it is extremely bitter to realize that the strength of values we profoundly disagreed with was such that that was not a realizable goal. That's hard. But as it would apply to Vietnam, I remember being in some private conversations recently between senior American officials and Vietnamese diplomats about the question of jailing independent voices, bloggers, particularly on the environment. And I worked 20, 25 years ago quite a lot on China, on human rights in China, and realized that to press very publicly on things like human rights and the detention of dissidents is not only politically very, very hard, it's actually often counterproductive. The Chinese learned very intelligently that if American pressure led to the release of dissidents, well, you just take another one. You'd let this guy out, and the next day you'd pick up another one because they're bargaining chips. And there's a sort of realism about what can be accomplished through foreign policy impulses that are, you know, the best possible impulses. And these, in these conversations between Vietnamese and American politicians, there was a great deal of pressure from liberal quarters to denounce the Vietnamese government for locking up dissidents, which is obviously a terrible thing to do, but knowing that it would be counterproductive to do that publicly. And so the insistence is private, and the insistence is built on an acceptance, again, that there are many, many common interests, and there are many fundamental differences. And you reach the fundamental differences by working through first the common interest, and then having a trust. Even if you disapprove in what the others are doing, you have a basis of trust on which to have the conversation. It may not always work. And as you say, in the end, there's a sort of necessary lesson of humility there, learned humility.
Thank you both. Yeah, we had several questions related to that topic in the Q&A box, so really appreciate you both taking the time to answer that. I want to move on to this question, which has a bit of a preface. This audience member said that they were a new ensign in the US Navy when President Kennedy was lost. When they had to decide on a permanent assignment, they volunteered for a unit that worked in Southeast Asia, and that was in 1962. They were working on the Perfume River. They were in that unit for 16 months, and 3 weeks after they left, their unit deployed to Vietnam. So they were heavily invested in the freedom of the Vietnamese that President Kennedy sent them there to deliver, and they say they still feel very invested, not just in the men that they lost, but in the mission that they were sent on and failed. So, George, I know you you interviewed a number of veterans for your book. So is this a common feeling carried by veterans who served in Vietnam?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that there's an extraordinary diversity of opinion among veterans. One interesting thing is I think it's true to say that most veterans who served in Vietnam still don't want to talk about it or think about it. I mean, I've done talks where veterans have come up to me afterwards with their children, and their children have taken me aside and said, you know, this is the first time my dad has been willing to talk about it. It was just too painful. He's buried it for all these years. And there are many, and I think there's a very, very real argument here, which maybe a lot of people would disagree with, that especially in the early days, that Mr. Rodin, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I apologize if I'm wrong, Mr. Rodin or Rodine, is raising in the chat, especially in that very early generation. I have a huge admiration, for example, for the Special Forces, which may sound surprising, given that the book is born out of a deep conviction that the war in the end proved to be a terrible mistake. But when you look at the granular story of people who served in those early years of, you know, Camelot and Kennedy and this idealism of the time, I think there was a great deal of humanitarian sincerity in those who went to serve. You know, they went to dangerous border areas in the mountains, working with ethnic minority people and, you know, learning the customs of the country and doing vaccination campaigns. I think it was a lot of idealism. And I think the nature of the war, you know, whatever the policymakers' deeper concerns and whatever the follies of believing in the domino theory, I still think that, you know, the great majority of people who volunteered, especially in those early days, was very benevolent. And so the disillusionment, I think, that followed is correspondingly much greater and much harder to deal with.
So this question, I believe, is following up on a point that you made earlier, George, but the audience member asked, can you clarify what you meant that POW is not an issue? I'm thinking of John McCain.
Yeah. No, I phrased that in a way that may have been open to misunderstanding. I was talking about the period that that Ambassador Osius was talking about in the 80s and into the 90s, when the issue of the POWs, there was a large-scale release of POWs at the time of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, when several hundred known prisoners came home. And there was an anomalous list of perhaps a few dozen to 100 or so who were not satisfactorily accounted for. They were anomalous cases. And out of that grew really what turned over time in the bitterness of those years into a sort of conspiracy theory, which led to things like Rambo, and it led to, you know, American vigilantes who would go off on these quixotic missions to find people who didn't exist. And the idea was that there were these secret prison camps, you know, somewhere deep in the jungles of Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where men were being held for no reason that anyone could explain, because if they were being held, there was no logic other than to use them as bargaining chips, and they weren't being used. Those were the ones I meant who did not exist. And McCain himself was deeply involved with other members of the Senate in exhaustive studies of this problem right through to the mid-1990s and the moment of normalization, and debunked the idea that there had been for many, many years any surviving American prisoners. That's what I was trying to say.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to finish on this question. You mentioned that Biden recently went to Vietnam, both of you mentioned this, and pledged to work with the Vietnamese president on a comprehensive strategic partnership. So either of you, please feel free to answer this, but where do you think the US-Vietnam relations are headed over the next decade?
I'll defer to you on that one, Ted.
Sure. Thank you. We have built a foundation of trust over the last 30 years, I think. There are a lot of common strategic interests, and we certainly have plenty of differences because we still disagree on what are fundamental human rights. We still disagree on things like freedom of expression. but there are some strategic interests and, to a lesser extent, economic interests that I think bind our two countries together. But the fundamental thing is what George talked about early on, which is trust. You have to build trust if you want a relationship to work. It's not just about money and power. It's not just transactional. There's got to be trust. And I think what this book is so good about at doing is describing those early efforts to do things together that build trust. I actually now Vietnam does more on the security side, does more with the United States than with any other country by a long shot. And so I don't think there's any ceiling on the relationship. There may be a pace at which the Vietnamese are comfortable to move, because they still have this enormous, Goliath, this huge neighbor on the northern border, and they can't move too fast in their ties with us, or there will be a swift and painful response from China. But the Vietnamese have taken risks to strengthen their ties with us. George mentioned when they moved us to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership, that's the same level as the relationship with Russia and China. And that means that even the most conservative, in their terms, conservative members of the Communist Party have agreed. In fact, I know that all members of the Politburo agreed on this switch. So the Vietnamese have decided to trust us, decided to work with us, decided that we have more in common and that there's more that we can work on together than that divides us. And I think the US has responded in kind. Yes, we have shared interests, differences, but also shared interests. So I think the future of the relationship is very bright.
I think it's very, very hard to see it turning back at this point. I'll add just one postscript to that, which to me is the biggest irony in some ways, but also the most interesting takeaway from this book, is that what finally nailed down all of the ingredients of this new relationship, above all, was the worst and most contentious issue of all, which was Agent Orange.
Yes.
Because Agent Orange, through the efforts of the military on both sides, which is always the toughest nut in any diplomatic relationship between two countries, especially former adversaries, is the military. It was through Agent Orange that the military establishments on both sides bought into the relationship fully. It has a lot to do with China. It has a lot to do with protecting the common interests in South China Sea. It's very pragmatic. But I think that was the key to finally cementing the whole relationship together.
So I just have to agree with that. I wrote a book also, Nothing is Impossible, America's Reconciliation with Vietnam, where I also focused very much on Agent Orange, because I think when you get to something as tough as that, and you're able to find common ground and work together through a problem as difficult as that, that makes a lot of things possible. And it's certainly freed up the energy on both sides for us to do much more together across the board.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned your book, because you began this by generously plugging mine, and I'll reciprocate by generously plugging yours, which is a book that is very, very worth reading, because it really is I'm telling a story as an outsider. This is an insider's story with authority of having been there, not just as ambassador for a particular period, but continuously in different capacities for getting close now to 30 years. It's a very valuable book, and I learned a lot from it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much again for being here. If you have anything you'd like to close out with before I do my closing remarks, feel free.
Read George's book.
Read Ted's book.
All right, good. Thank you.